So thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Audrey Farley, who is the author of The Unfit Heiress, The Tragic Life and Scandalous Sterilization of Anne Cooper Hewitt. She earned a PhD in English literature from the University of Maryland, College Park, and now teaches history and creative writing. Her essays have appeared in The Atlantic, New Republic, Washington, and the Washington Post, and many other outlets. And she currently lives in Hanover, Pennsylvania. Hopefully I've got all that right, Dr. Farley. And she's going to be presenting a talk today based on her upcoming book, which I believe is out on the 13th of June. And the talk's entitled Psychiatry's It Girls, the Genain Quadruplets and the Making of Madness. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. So I thought that I would begin by talking about how I even came to this really wild story. So this story for me really began with a phone call that I got from my mother, who was reading Bob Kolker's Hidden Valley Road. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, if not read it, about a family of 12 children where 6 were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And she reported that while she was reading this book, she had come across a fascinating story within the story. There was an aside about 4 quadruplets who had all been diagnosed with schizophrenia following a traumatic childhood. And it was a strange case of nature versus nurture, and she thought it could be my next book. Now, I admit I wasn't initially that interested, but after hanging up the phone, I did Google the Genain Quadruplets, and I found Patrick Hahn's essay about them in Mad in America. So what I quickly learned about them from Hahn's essay and other Google research is that these quadruplets, whose real name was Morlock, were a set of identical sisters born in Lansing, Michigan in 1930 to much fanfare. Their celebrity swept their father, who's pictured here, into public office. He had a reputation for being something of a deadbeat, but their celebrity, established him as a public figure, and he was elected constable for the next few decades. And all 4 of the girls were diagnosed with schizophrenia in their 20s in the 1950s, which caught the attention of researchers at the newly formed National Institute of Mental Health. So I'll back up a little bit about NIMH. It had opened its doors in 1949. It was the brainchild of Robert Felix, who was a military psychiatrist, a neo-Freudian, and a big believer in social psychiatry. So making the world better so that fewer people are suffering from mental illness and distress. Despite these commitments to social psychiatry, to neo-Freudianism, Felix perceived a need for NIMH to be scientific. Now, this institute is part of the broader National Institutes of Health, and the other institutes are studying things like cancer and biological disease. So the pressure was there from the get-go for NIMH to be scientific. So in the name of being a hard science, Felix appoints a scientific director whose name was Seymour Ketty, and he was a neuroscientist by training, who believed that the brain held clues to genetics, and that examining twins in which one or more had a schizophrenia diagnosis could prove fruitful in understanding that mental illness. So as we were kind of chatting before this began, twin studies had already been around, and they had found higher concordance rates or both twins diagnosed in monozygotic twins than dizygotic ones. So the identical twins who share genetics are more likely to both be diagnosed. But of course, critics dismissed that finding on the basis that identical twins also share more of their environment. So Ketty, the scientific director, really believed that he could separate the effects of nature and nurture. And in his words, build a bridge across the big chasm between the basic knowledge of the brain and mental illness. So when Ketty and these other researchers learn about the quadruplets from Michigan, they really couldn't believe their ears. As far as they could tell, the estimated frequency of quadruplet births with at least one surviving was about 1 in a million. Only 1 in 10 of those birth sets was monozygotic. And while the number of births with all 4 surviving was not documented, it was thought to be about half, making the Morlock sisters 1 in approximately 20 million births. And then the chance of their all having schizophrenia was estimated to be about 1 in 1.5 billion. So the researchers, they don't think that they're ever again going to have such an opportunity for study, and they swiftly bring the family to Bethesda. And at first, it really did seem to be a clear case of genetic defect. So David Rosenthal, who is pictured on the right, and he was a Johns Hopkins research psychologist who was hired by NIMH specifically to lead the quadruplets research committee. And he went on to author the book where they compiled all of their research. You can see it pictured there. It came out in 1963. The quadruplets were studied at NIMH from 1955 to 1958, and then a few years passed and the book comes out. So in that book, Rosenthal writes, "One could hardly help but wonder what further proof of a genetic etiology of schizophrenia anyone would want to have." But after 3 years of study, which included psychiatric evaluations, doll play, handwriting analyses, Rorschach tests, galvanic skin response tests, electroencephalography, and much more, they adopted a more measured theory, which Rosenthal outlined in his book. And he said that the sisters suffered from, quote, "an unhappy collusion of nature and nurture." So in his mind, they had inherited some predisposition to illness and then been subjected to this thoroughly pathogenic home. He claimed that both of their parents practiced irrationality and they wielded control over every aspect of the girls' lives. He further said that there were both vertical and horizontal identification patterns within the family, meaning that the quadruplets over-identified with their parents and with one another. So the weak points of Rosenthal's book are evident to modern critics, as Hahn, who I mentioned at the beginning, who wrote an essay on them for Mad in America, wrote, "The fact that all 4 were reportedly sexually assaulted didn't seem to strike Rosenthal or the book's contributors as consequential." So they acknowledged, both that their father had fondled them and that they had been abused by other people in the community, but they didn't perceive it as being consequential to the development of schizophrenia. Hahn also notes that the pseudonym assigned to the family, Genain, meaning dire birth, prioritized genetics. And then over time, over the decades, the story of the Genain quadruplets became even more one-sided. So tragedy forces Rosenthal into retirement, and NIMH's psychology laboratory really capitulates to the brain sciences. And so his successors seem more decided that mostly biology is to blame. And the sisters become these poster children of psychiatric genetics. Hahn writes, "Their cases invoked to illustrate the primacy of heredity, though it probably reveals much more about its chroniclers than its intended subjects." So when I first read this essay by Hahn, I was riveted because it seemed to me to chart the making of this scientific myth, but it also described the strangest and most sordid scene of abuse. A father who was obsessed with his daughter's virtue, made their home, which is pictured here, into a prison, which he patrolled with a shotgun. Behind the always drawn blinds, he permitted them no privacy. He would even watch as they undressed and even fondled them. He claimed that he was only doing this to gauge how they'd later react on dates, although when the time came, he forbade them from going on such dates. When he and his wife caught two of the sisters masturbating around 11 years of age, they took them to a doctor who surgically mutilated them. Following their high school graduation, 3 of the quadruplets were assaulted outside the home, and the patriarch of the family, the one who's so worried about preserving their innocence, does nothing about it. And during all this time, as Hahn writes, the local newspapers were running puff pieces portraying the Genains as the ideal American family. As I viewed internet photographs of the quadruplets, many of them as young girls in quaint stage costumes with perfectly coiffed hair, I could not shake the feeling that there was even more to this story. Prior to becoming the darlings of psychiatric genetics, I sensed these sisters had been the ambassadors of another, no less potent mythology, that of white racial innocence. So this patriarch of the family who's so paranoid that some monster is out there to ravish his daughters, hewed so closely to the segregationist under Jim Crow, which was the time in which these sisters were being raised. The surgeon who operated upon these 2 masturbating girls recalled in my mind the eugenicists that I had chronicled in my first book, The Unfit Heiress, about a woman who was deemed oversexed and thus prone to cross the color line. And the townsfolk's wholly symbolic investment in the family, their utter fascination with what these girls represented, and their utter indifference to the actual goings-on behind closed doors, brought to mind both the segregationists and the eugenicists who put white females on a pedestal to justify lynching and other forms of racial terror. So what I argue in my book is that Rosenthal's 600-page tome really substantiates this framing, even as it never analyzes race or racism in connection with its main subjects. In fact, after reading Rosenthal's book, The Genain Quadruplets, I was left with the feeling that the specter of the Third Reich, and not just Jim Crow, loomed large over these sisters' lives. And in my own book, I try to chase these 2 ghosts, urging that neither the quadruplets' lives nor their scientific legacy can be fully understood apart from the hybrid cultures of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. So what do we learn in Rosenthal's book? Well, the quadruplets' father, and his name was Carl Morlock, emigrated to the United States as a young boy. His mother told him quite explicitly that Germans were superior and that he should marry one of his own kind, as people from other nationalities were responsible for America's troubles. And though neither Rosenthal nor his contributors say so, such views were very common because, at this time, eugenicists were warning that immigration and race mixing were going to lead to the downfall of white civilization. And, you can see here, this is a picture of a eugenics health exhibit. These contests were held at state fairs all across the country, where people could have their noses measured and their skin assessed for how creamy it was and all of this. In the name of the race, eugenicists also targeted whites who were thought to be defective, which would explain, as Rosenthal did report, why doctors sterilized one of Carl's nieces who had apparently low intelligence. Popular culture at the time also portrayed the quote lower races as breeding like animals. And this anxiety, this idea of their animality and their low classness really gripped Carl. So after he married a part Irish woman named Sadie Lyon, he would recoil whenever she made advances, once asking, "Are you in heat?" Upon learning that she birthed multiples, so right after the quads have been born, the first words out of his mouth are, "What will they think my wife is? A bitch dog?" The doctor who delivered the quadruplets was even more pointed. When a pregnant Sadie conveyed her suspicions that she was carrying more than one, he replied, "Aren't you a white woman?" So this idea that only people of color are hyperfertile, only people of color and the low class breed like animals, that language is conveyed in these early days of the quadruplets' lives. Now, good thing for Carl, the town early decided that his daughters embodied innocence, deserving endless charity and a stage career that not so subtly yoked innocence to white Christian Americanness. By 6, the ribbon-wearing girls were traveling the Midwest to perform patriotic and religious tunes, some of which contained racial slurs. On at least one occasion, they opened for minstrel performers aboard a riverboat named Robert E. Lee. So their sentimentalized helplessness serves as the stark contrast to the barbarity of men in blackface, as one of the sisters seems to have intuited. According to the Genain Quadruplets, Rosenthal's book, when this one sister was asked by a teacher to wear her hair differently to allow staff to better distinguish her from her sisters, she joked that she ought to come to school in blackface. So it's little wonder that in this world that is really obsessed with casting dark-skinned people as a menace to fair-skinned children, no one really seemed to notice when one of the girls began to disappear with the school janitor, nor when the same girl began to come to school with bruises. Little wonder as well that the quadruplets' overly protective father brushed it off when the first of his daughters was assaulted in the workplace. So remember, this is the guy who would feel them up, supposedly to test their morals, who would prevent them from dating, would draw the blinds of the house, was hyper-protective. When one is assaulted in the workplace, he says, "Oh, that fellow's all right. He wouldn't do anything. Maybe he was just intoxicated and scared you. You are liable to find people like that from time to time, so you should learn to handle yourself." So after all this supposed preparing for his daughters, he claims not to believe it when rape is attempted. And it certainly seemed to me that Carl imagined very particular villains whom this man simply did not resemble. So when someone in his circle violated women, it didn't count. When the quadruplets arrived at NIMH, again, this is in 1955, so they're 25 years, about to turn 25 years old. They were deathly afraid of penetration, which they associated with contamination. A psychologist analyzing Rorschach protocols found that they were fixated on disease, dirt, and being intruded. So was Carl, actually, who suspected a Jewish psychiatrist of sleeping with his wife. Carl also startled to learn that his social worker was Jewish, although he appeared to tolerate this man, saying there's good and bad in all of us. So Sarah Morlock, who is the sole surviving quadruplet, she had her 93rd birthday last week, has told me that her father deeply admired Hitler, that he hoped once Germany won the war, Hitler would come to America and purge the country of its own waste humanity. Sometimes he would even make these feelings known when the family was out to dinner and their mother would have to shush him. She would have to say, "You're American now. They'll deport us if you talk like that." But just as the local newspapers only ever portrayed the family as picture perfect, the government researchers seemed to write race out of the story. And this was despite the fact that many of them, including Rosenthal, were Jewish. So I asked myself, how could this be? And there are a few reasons, I would say. Reading through the Genain Quadruplets, Rosenthal's book, it really became clear to me that many psychologists and social workers at the Institute were enthralled by the schizophrenogenic mother theory, put forth by Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, who's pictured here. And that theory basically posited that mothers drove their children crazy with a confusing mixture of warmth and hostility. And we know that she didn't mean to singularly blame women, but the theory kind of took off. And so these researchers who were presented with a man as hateful and abusive as Carl, still one after another of them blamed Sadie, the girl's mother, for their problems. And they actually also blamed Carl's mother for his problems, which they tended to describe as mere quirks. Rosenthal's son, Scott, I was able to interview his 3 living children, suggested another reason for NIMH's silence on race when he told me that his father perceived a need to avoid moral judgments. And this makes a lot of sense. So he said that in the psychologist's mind, politics were antithetical to science. And this is an idea that Hannah Zevin wrote about last year in N+1. This idea that there was a neutrality mandate, she calls it, which really gripped Freud's devotees in particular, many of whom had actually endured racial trauma. So she explains that when wartime Jewish analysts were forced to flee Europe for the United States, they didn't speak what they'd endured, and instead really determined to be the disembodied listeners that America required for its own victims and perpetrators of violence. So in her words, Zevin writes, "It simply didn't matter if a case had its roots in the Holocaust or that a patient or their parent had survived atrocity. All that mattered was the transference, the psychic action in the room." And of course, she traces this neutrality mandate back to Freud, who desperately wanted to be taken seriously, right? Freud wanted psychoanalysis to be taken as science. Another thing is that the psychology laboratory at NIMH at the time didn't have Black psychologists or psychiatrists who were a lot less willing to cordon off the world when they were considering people's distress. By the 1980s, some such professionals had come together to found the Black Psychiatrists of America, which immediately put pressure on NIMH to diversify its ranks. But even while NIMH officials did declare racism to be the #1 public health problem facing America, the Institute was slow to comply, and staff members, including Ketty, the scientific director, disparaged efforts to address, quote, minority problems. And both internal researchers and external grants favored biological research, looking, for instance, at the outcomes of patients who were put on antipsychotics, which were by this time, of course, being hailed as magic bullets. So when the quadruplets returned for follow-up studies, and I'll try to move this here, you can see people pictured, Alan Mirsky and Lynn DeLisi. When they returned in 1981, shortly after Rosenthal's retirement, the door had really been closed on these more sociological lines of inquiry. So Rosenthal's successors subjected the sisters, along with two of Sarah's sons. Sarah was the only one to marry and have children, to blood and neurological tests, lumbar puncture, not really bothering to discern what occupied their conscious or unconscious minds. And it turns out, for reasons I explain in the book, that their house had really remained a house of horrors long after their father's death. In 1996, when the quadruplets were 66, researchers went to Michigan to search for a chromosomal oddity that had been found in Swedish triplets who were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And they came up short. They didn't find that abnormality in the quads, but they marveled that with the help of prescription drugs, the sisters had managed to lead relatively normal lives. And again, that's something that I dispute. Now, it doesn't surprise that the quadruplet studies are largely regarded as a travesty among psychiatry's critics. So besides Hahn, Lucy Johnstone, Jay Joseph, Richard Benthal, and Peter Breggin have criticized either Rosenthal or his successors for downplaying childhood trauma. And yet, I would argue, it is not difficult to see myth-making in some of their own analyses. So Breggin, for instance, suggests that Rosenthal's suggestion of a genetic basis was, quote, a form of child abuse, while Benthal accuses Rosenthal and his colleagues of being so dogmatic, and here's a quote, so exclusively genetic, that they shrugged off the harms the sisters had suffered. So in my view, these statements really ignore the painstaking attention that the Genain Quadruplets contributors paid to familial relationships, parental communication styles, the schizophrenogenic mother, inner conflicts. I mean, the fact is that it was people gripped by the schizophrenic mother theory, not the more biologically minded who first let Carl off the hook. And yes, their inattention to abuse is a shortcoming of their analysis, but it's not evidence that they were gunning for genetics. I would further say that with these distortions, Breggin and Benthal are reducing the quadruplets to the flat, silent objects of their youth. So here, the women who adored Rosenthal, they're pictured here with him. He would visit them throughout the rest of his time. They would write him soul-bearing letters. They would telephone him when they were in despair. And they just become these screens onto which Breggin and Benthal can project their stories about their enemies in psychiatry's culture war. And they really are stories, I would argue, because both of them, Breggin and Benthal, go so far as to portray Rosenthal as a promoter of Nazi science. They do this on the basis that he admired the theories of inheritance that were articulated by psychiatrist Ernst Rudin and Franz Kallman, who were associated with the Third Reich, and in Kallman's case with the American eugenics movement. So I ask myself, what does it mean that two well-known critics can essentially call a beloved Jewish man a Nazi while failing to see how the legacies of anti-Semitism and racism materially impacted the quadruplets? At the very least, I think it means that psychiatry's detractors have their own ideologies to deconstruct. The prevailing whiteness of the psi professions have prevented many from seeing race and racism as core parts of the psyche. And this is an argument that Hannah Zeven makes in her piece in N+1, which I would recommend everyone read. I would say that whiteness has further prevented people from seeing how sexual trauma can double as racial trauma, requiring more sophisticated frameworks for understanding a case like the quadruplets. So I'll explain what I mean by that. Like many sex abuse victims, the sisters suffered from deep shame and guilt. In fact, Rosenthal's readers learn that Sarah's psychotherapy at NIMH, she was the only one to really have effective and meaningful psychotherapy at NIMH. She did that with Seymour Perlin, another well-known figure. That a lot of her psychotherapy was focused on getting her to accept the fact of sex and herself physically. How much were her feelings of guilt and shame exacerbated by the meaning that white society ascribed to her body, by the fact that the townsfolk had essentially made her body a stand-in for the national body to be kept pure of invaders and undesirables. And it certainly seems to me that she did have some sense of her representational significance, because she told her therapist that she perceived a need to be a good girl or else risk the world falling apart. You know, we might also think about these are the two figures who kept coming up in my research, Sandor Ferenczi and Anna Freud. Their theories of confusion of tongues and identification with the aggressor remain compelling theories for understanding why some individuals identify with their abusers. So at the risk of telling you things you already know, in 1932, Ferenczi suggested that trauma robbed children of their senses, putting them into a dissociative trance where they became transfixed by the desires and behaviors of their aggressor. He said children were easily disoriented by a confusion of tongues because abusers didn't just threaten and scare, but they would provide affection and security. And Freud, for her part, suggested that this identification with the aggressor is a defense mechanism intended to protect the self from hurt and disorganization. So by taking on this identity of the person who's harmed them, a child feels empowered. I would ask, isn't this affinity for predators easily compounded by the pervasive logic of lynching, which insists upon white virtue and tricks countless white girls and women into believing they need to submit to the very men who are prone to hurt them? So I can't help but think of Sarah, again, the only quadruplet to marry, who specifically sought a spouse who wouldn't rape her, settling on a military man who very closely resembled her father. And though he did never force himself on her, he was really indifferent when his friends made unwanted advances. She said, quote, "He was never protective of me at all, telling people I could take care of myself." So this reality surely runs counter to the world that she was made to stage in minstrel shows, which is that the white man is the protector and keeps someone safe from violence. Now, some people might argue society has evolved since the quadruplets' adolescence. And it's certainly true that blackface, these other racist cultural practices that the quads were made to participate in, are now deemed impolite. But I would argue that the legends of Jim Crow have endured and have been adapted to target other perceived enemies. So consider here the public's insatiable appetite for what literary scholar Dora Ahmad calls oppressed Muslim women narratives. Think, for instance, of Betty Mahmoudi's Not Without My Daughter, which portrays Arab men as being beast-like. We might also think about President Trump calling Mexican immigrants rapists, or the growing number of conservatives, especially in the US, who describe gay and trans adults as grooming, even sodomizing children. So there's no question that we are still living in a moral panic with those in power brandishing the innocence of certain people to authorize violence against others. In recent days, a lot of psychologists and service providers have rightly expressed concern for LGBTQ plus children and those of color who are just being demonized by too many stakeholders to name. As these children are the most vulnerable, they do deserve the greatest consideration. But the story of the Genain Quadruplets, I would argue, demands that we also ask, what will happen to the youth who are being made to symbolize innocence, which is nowadays reduced to cisness, sexual purity, and whiteness? They too are being forced to bear these burdens of slavery and segregation. And they too deserve better than the culture of death that these white mythologies promulgate. The other timely takeaway from the story for me is that when a society encourages people to express their bigotries and their racial anxieties as sexual ones, in other words, when society coaxes people to describe their enemies as some kind of menace to children, it can really render those minds pornographic, as we see with Carl and the other townsfolk. And this too is really psychologically and socially corrosive. So there's so much about this story that I find to be timely and instructive. For me, it's not just a story about psychiatry's culture wars, but also about how delusions come to take root, not just in individuals, but in nations. So thank you for the chance to share that.
Thank you so much for a really rich and very nuanced talk. I think there's a lot to kind of unpack there. As usual, I have lots of questions, but I'm going to open it up to everybody else in the first instance. And so if we say maybe just kind of raise your hand, either kind of virtually or on the video, and we'll so Ian, I can see your hands up there. So if you want to unmute yourself.
Absolutely fascinating. So I my own personal story. I grew up with a mother who developed schizophrenia when she was 3. My brother was born, so I was 3 years old, and she was a feature throughout my childhood, and very distinctively had schizophrenia in the sense that Emil Kraepelin had described dementia precox. I'm left wondering, because I just assumed that these 4 ladies had schizophrenia. Did they hear voices? Did they have delusions? Did they have negative features of schizophrenia? Would they have made caseness criteria for a diagnosis of schizophrenia?
Mm-hmm.
You didn't particularly mention it in the story.
Yes, they did. They all had schizophrenia diagnoses. Actually, both in Michigan, they went to a hospital there and were diagnosed. I think all but one of them had what was then called undifferentiated type. And then when they went to NIMH, they were re-diagnosed there, and more of them were found to have paranoid type. I think the severity of it varied for them. In one of the pictures I had shared, one of the quads is practically catatonic. She just kind of like appeared gone to observers for most of the 3 years that she was at NIH. It's not any surprise that she was the worst treated, both by their father, and she was the one who, would disappear with the janitor. She was picked on as being like the bad quadruplet from a very young age. She struggled to keep up with the others, so she was kind of early pegged as the problematic one. So by the time she was at NIH, she's just already suffering so much. And it's hard for me to say that people at NIMH did or didn't work hard at therapy for her. I think that there were 30 researchers that studied them, and some of them, cared deeply about the girls. I don't buy the argument that's often put forth by critics of this case that they were just totally exploited as research objects. I think some of the people, including Rosenthal, really cared for them. Whether they could have done more, we can argue about that. And then there was somebody like Sarah who had like 600 hours of psychotherapy, just kind of this ideal, life for 3 years because she's away from her father. She's at this facility, which was really modeled after a little town. I don't know. This is something that really surprised me about NIMH, is that they really wanted this campus to be like a simulation of society. So they would have like a newsstand, a restaurant, a barber shop, so that these people who were being studied did have a chance of becoming well. So that was a really long-winded answer to your question, but I never questioned, the diagnoses.
Famously, Emil Kraplin's characterization of schizophrenia was broadened by Bleuler, who gave us the name schizophrenia. And I think if you go for a strict definition of schizophrenia versus a kind of more Bleuler type definition, you maybe get 4 times as many cases. So if you're ignoring hearing voices and hearing one's thoughts out loud and certain delusions, but looking more at autistic traits, you can have a very wide definition of schizophrenia that maybe, so it makes me want, I await your book with interest. It makes me want to find out more about what were their psychopathology. And the fact there were 4 of them, we know about folia dea, but did they share delusions, folia catra or something, but it's anyway, that technical stuff that I would be interested in, but I'll check out the book. I've pre-ordered your book, and I actually got your other book delivered today. So
thank you.
I buy a lot of books. Anyway, I'll shut up and let someone else come in. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. I can see I see Gordon's got his hand raised. Gordon, do you want to?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Gordon. Unless it's just at my end, it's very, very crackly. I can't hear a word you're saying there. Is that the same for you, Dr. Farley?
I can't hear.
Oh, speak now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's grand.
Yeah, great. I was just saying, like Ian, I buy a lot of books, but I'm afraid I don't read as many of them as Ian does. I mean, I think the historical perspective is so useful for us in psychiatry generally, and it's absolutely fascinating to hear you, reach back in time in that way, including thinking about the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And there was a meeting at the college 1.5 years ago where Professor Andrew Moskowitz talked about the history of schizophrenia. And in 1911, it was a far broader concept and certainly included what we would understand as DID now. And I reread Anna O, Freud's history, and that's a classic case of DID, contested, that whole concept contested by psychiatrists. So it's a very contentious field, the whole idea. But what was very striking for me, given that we need to be more philosophical, I think, that the historical perspective underlines that. And I think Whitehead said in 1926 that unless science becomes more philosophical, it would degenerate into a medley of ad hoc hypotheses, and I think you mentioned what the issues were, but what was very striking for me was it was as if schizophrenia was identified with as just one thing, and everything was generalized from that. So you have a presentation of schizophrenia, which presents so variously, and they were saying, this proves that schizophrenia is such and such, just looking at one case, and that seems to be, absolutely extraordinary. And I think in medicine, we go through medicine, and we don't have 1 hour on the philosophy of science. We learn lots of facts. Our ability to step back on a meta level and think about that is kind of absolutely incredible. And Robin Murray, who's one of the doyens of schizophrenia, I expect to see the concept of schizophrenia ending soon. It's already beginning to break down, for example, into those cases caused by copy number genetic variations, drug abuse, social adversity. Presumably this process will accelerate and the term schizophrenia will be confined to history like dropsy, and it's like saying heart failure. We can look at one case of heart failure and generalize from it. So that seems extraordinary when we look back in any philosophical way to see how they're drawing conclusions. And, I think that historical perspective is wonderful to help us step back and be a bit more critical about what we're doing. Fantastic your project is, I think, helping us do that, helping us step back and be a bit critical about what we're doing, which is very sorely needed, I think. That was a bit of a ramble, but a way of thanking you for the talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. I remember seeing some psychiatrist on Twitter tweet, well, maybe some cases of schizophrenia are caused by genetics and some are caused by, early childhood sexual trauma. And at the time, it really blew my mind. Mm-hmm. And then I had to ask myself, well, like, why do I think, or why do I accept others' arguments that it has to be this one single thing that causes?
Yeah. And in clinical practice, I remember my first year or two as a junior, there were two brothers with a fairly normal childhood, both completely mad. And, it didn't seem to be any. And then there was a young man from Iraq, who'd been in a horrific situation, tortured and so on, and had developed psychosis. Very, very different, and why can it not be a spectrum? And at one end you see an extreme, and at the other end you extreme. And a lot of it's, why does it have to be either or rather than both and? It's just, yeah. And that's not going into the whole history of our need to make psychiatry something that has proper biomarkers and so on and so on. That's a whole nother area. But anyway, I'll shut up for the moment. Thank you.
Douglas, thank you.
Yeah, just no, it's really interesting and linking schizophrenia with race. I think in the 1950s, certainly into the 60s, people seriously thought that schizophrenia was a disease of white people, Europeans, wasn't it? That the black people didn't have sophisticated enough brains to have this subtle illness, schizophrenia, and it was actually posed that people questioned did the First Nation people in Australia get schizophrenia, for example, and it didn't happen in Africa. Some people said it's quite extraordinary, and that the strength of the racial thinking around about 1950s was really powerful. One wonders about the father. Did he have a diagnosis of schizophrenia? It certainly sounds a very odd person and paranoid, perhaps. But was there other illness in the family?
Well, NIMH was so thorough in the family trees that they traced in this family, the interviews that they conducted. They went to Lansing, Michigan, and interviewed school teachers, doctors, the mailman, everybody. And they came to the conclusion that Carl probably was an undiagnosed schizophrenia and that his mother may have been as well. And a lot of their basis for saying so is that they are extremely paranoid. Now, of course, my hunch is to ask, well, isn't some of this paranoia coming from this Jim Crow world that they're living in, right? That is encouraging people to be paranoid that this person is out to get you or your daughters. So the conclusion that they came to was that there was probably the genetic piece, because they thought it was a collusion of nature and nurture. The genetic piece was coming from Carl and his mother. And it was their mother who was just, such a disastrous parent that she was mostly responsible for the pathogenic home. Yeah.
David, is your, I think your hands up? Were you wanting to?
Yes, if that's okay. I think I was mistakenly pressing the clapping button
you were
previously, but
passionately clapping away there. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. But that was actually entirely appropriate, because I would like to certainly thank Audrey for a fabulous presentation. I've always felt a little guilt. Richard Bentel and Peter Brigden had their own agendas, which more than distorted their perspectives. But I know that, I would think that anyway. You've taken a very, to my mind, detached and intelligent view of a very, very complicated issue. And my simple or not so simple question is, was there anything that you uncovered that you could feed back to us as a simple piece of advice to jobbing psychiatrists in terms of what we maybe should or shouldn't do in some contexts?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, there needs to be more literacy generally about race and racism and how they are like formative parts of the psyche. It's not, as the mid-century researchers at NIMH thought, something that you could just kind of coat check at the door, right? And the other piece of the puzzle that I haven't talked about so much in this presentation is religion. But one thing that I was happy to find in my research for this book is that a growing number of psychologists and service providers are taking religious trauma seriously, as something, that can, like in the case of the quadruplets, have some of the same long-term effects, we might even say symptoms, that people with more recognized DSM disorders have. Religion can get under the skin. The quadruplets' father in this case certainly used religion as another mechanism of controlling them. So, he would tell Sarah, that if anything terrible ever happened to their family, it was because she disobeyed God, and she was a terrible person in his eyes and whatnot. She would read the book of Revelation and would kind of let the ideas of this kind of cataclysmic event really take over. And it's easy to see how, a schizophrenic left with the book of Revelation is a bad idea. But I think that religion, much like race, has been something that a lot of experts have, tried to cordon off as a topic. But I think that's less the case now. I think that, people are talking about religion and race.
No, thanks very much. And I'm sure you're aware. You ended with a comment about delusions. That one of the exclusion clauses for having a delusion is if enough other people believe it on either religious or political grounds, which I've always found a rather worrying concept. But no, genuinely, thank you very much indeed for that response and for your talk.
Thank you.
So I'm going to use this opportunity to chip in here. I suppose first of all, it was just a quick point, and just to kind of echo some of the comments that have already been said. Just, thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. It was particularly refreshing and kind of reassuring to hear such a kind of nuanced perspective on some of these issues. And I must admit, kind of having not had the opportunity to read the book yet, I was kind of a little bit apprehensive perhaps as to how much of your talk was going to kind of echo what Bentel and Breggin and the kind of MIA article, kind of that position that they took. And so it was really nice to hear kind of both the kind of limitations of a strictly biological genetic basis of schizophrenia, but to kind of highlight the as we were talking about earlier, the kind of straw man attacks that are often drawn out for whatever ideological or kind of political motivations there are. So thank you for that. I'm kind of a little bit cautious about asking this question because it's not an area that I'm at all well read on, but I'm going to persevere. So one of the things that stood out for me was obviously there's the tension between things like genetic factors and kind of clear trauma. So at the time, kind of Rosenthal conceptualized that in terms of the schizophrenic mother. You kind of highlighted that actually kind of there's a lot of kind of sexual abuse and other forms of abuse. But in the background of all of this, what was so interesting was that you highlighted there were these kind of more insidious socio-political factors around race, sexism, eugenics, and so on, that aren't immediately in the foreground. We don't necessarily automatically recognize them. And it kind of made me think a little bit of sort of Foucault's work and kind of that idea of these kind of processes that are happening in the background and kind of might mask how we think about things. And I just wondered if that was a parallel, if that was a parallel you'd drawn in the book, or if that's even a reasonable way of kind of thinking about things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I wasn't explicitly thinking about Foucault. I mean, I read him in grad school, but, I didn't read a whole lot of him in researching this book. But, if I could just comment a little bit more to your point about, about these wars in psychiatry, these culture wars, I was so taken aback by the way that Rosenthal is maligned by critics of psychiatry. Like, it blew my mind that this Jewish man, literally, he's a Jewish man. He actually came to psychology because he had been drafted in the war, fighting fascists, working for a neuropsychiatrist on the battlefield who professed to hate Nazis as much as he loved psychoanalysis, came to this field of research, literally fighting Nazis, that he could then be lumped together with the Third Reich just took my breath away. I told his children about some of those caricatures, and they were stunned. They were absolutely stunned, that this man, who they'd always known as a very revered researcher, could be reduced to this cartoon, which was just totally dishonest and hateful, in order for people to make a point in psychiatry's culture wars. And, I'm conscious of making this critique that people just use this story to write their own narrative, because here I am, having written a book about the quadruplets, which brings my perspectives to the table. And so I was kind of like thinking, like, what am I doing that's different than Bregan and Benthal? And I think that one of the things I'm doing is that I've tried very hard to have their voices on the page. And it's really something to me how a lot of these critiques don't recuperate their voices at all. Like, they are just so totally silenced in this retelling of the case. Especially, with regard to Rosenthal. These women loved him. The surviving quadruplet, Sarah, she cannot hear his name without glowing. So for them to just so totally disregard how the family felt about him was just really something to me.
Yeah, thank you. And I it was very striking. I think one of the first things you said was that if I've got this right, you quoted Rosenthal and described it as he described it rather as an unhappy collusion of nature and nurture. And obviously that's hit the nail on the head. That this idea that it's it's about the interaction between environment and genetics. It's rarely a case of either or. And I thought that was quite striking for him to be saying that in the 1950s, 60s.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the first book I'll just say this very quickly and then I'll shut up. The first book I read on psychiatry was Bentl's Madness Explained, and it's what made me so interested. And at the time, I was absolutely outraged because I believed what he was saying. I thought, these idiotic psychiatrists, and then actually, as you train in psychiatry and practice, you realize that so many of, although there are valid criticisms to be made, that just so many of these attacks are kind of straw men or oversimplified. And I suppose one question is, it's an unfair question to ask you, but kind of how do we kind of navigate between these culture wars, and how do we make progress between what are valid, or what might be perceived as valid concerns around psychiatric practice, whatever they may be, and kind of what might be thought of as kind of reactionary or ideological or whatever, unfair criticisms that kind of caricature psychiatry in an unfair way?
Mm-hmm. That's a really tough question. But, I think part of what's happening here, and part of the reason why these straw men arguments take hold, is again because of race. When people say, that psychiatrists as a discipline are indifferent to racism, they are centering white voices, right? Black psychiatry has a rich history in the US. And many of them could see things that, mid-century researchers at NIMH couldn't, So when you are like making this straw man, are you writing off traditions? And I think that a lot of critics of psychiatry they're centering a very specific psychiatrist that they want to then cut down, right? This old white man, not a woman, not a person of color. Like they're very deliberate in the caricature that they build.
Thank you. I think David's hand went up first. David?
It was more a response to yourself, Chris, but I'd be interested in Audrey's perspective. Often the critiques of psychiatry, in my opinion, have an awful lot of validity. But if you want to counter them, it's useful to go to usually the third last page of a huge tome and read the paragraph in which they suggest something different, which is often laughably inept, in my humble opinion. It doesn't detract from the validity of the criticisms, but what they're replacing with is usually pathetic. But I'd be happy to have that countered. Cheers.
Yeah, Bento, I'm a very mild-mannered person, but 20 years ago, in an audience listening to Bento, I found myself being enraged. And it was personal, because he was denying that schizophrenia existed. And I was thinking, for 35 years of my life, or whatever it was then, I had a mother suffering with severe illness, and I had no doubt that's what it was. So it's curious that his anti-diagnostic stance is against the man you described, Rosenthal, who was bringing psychoanalytical, psychological concepts and not strictly a biological model to the analysis of these quadruplet sisters. And that it just seems he doesn't understand the toing and froing of models in psychiatry. Can I end with a rather, kind of ghoulish question? The other thing that came in the last few decades is brain scans. And the other thing, if people, real biological psychiatrists, might want to do is, once you die, do a post-mortem and look at your brain. Did any of that happen with the Genain quadruplets?
Yes, they did get brain scans in it was either their first or second follow-up, but it wasn't noteworthy. There just wasn't a whole lot of note. Yeah.
Gordon, thank you.
David hasn't had a, has David had a go? I saw his hand up as well.
Well,
Fair, David.
Oh, sorry, David, I completely
just
missed
no, you didn't miss me. It was a little fleeting hand, really.
I did think you were suspiciously quiet. I must.
Oh, right. Well, I was just thinking about the sort of moral dimensions to the storytelling here, and the predicament about telling another story about these quadruplets without making it in a sort of an instrumental, using them instrumentally, because so many people have. And it's something you allude to. But then I was also sort of thinking about, well, there is so much conflicting positions here about the nature of the good, you can put it that way, that goes on. I mean, you call them the culture wars, but within psychiatry, but the sort of identifications that we make and the identifications that are made for us are sort of linked, I think, to conceptions of the good, and it's deeply embedded in psychiatry, and we don't own it adequately. And I think that would help to have a much more explicit conversations about that. Because Richard Benthel, for example, I mean, he's quite missionary, and I think his zeal is based on some conception of the good. And he has his own personal story. His brother committed suicide, I believe, this sort of thing. So this is a framework behind psychiatry, which might sort of take us onto the sort of nature of human nature, I guess. But it's but that's why psychiatry is so fascinating. You get into that sort of stuff.
Yes, I was very pleasantly surprised to find that psychiatry was not the caricature that I found in some of the websites. And I'll just add that the talk that I gave is largely based on an essay that is going to be published in Mad America, which discusses Bregan and Benthel. And when I pitched it to them, I thought they were going to tell me to get lost, but they intend to publish the essay. So that will come out on June 13th.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time, and I'm also mindful that Gordon had his hand up, but I'm going to go to Kenneth. Yeah, I'm going to go to Kenneth, if that's all right, Gordon, just because he's not spoken yet. So Kenneth, thank you. If you could just unmute yourself.
Thank you very much indeed for your talk. I found so many threads and points of interest. I'm a social scientist, so I'm not a psychiatrist. But what interested me slightly, it might be a bit tangential to the discussion, was NIMH, or the National Mental Health Institutes in America. How closely was eugenics involved with them? Because in the UK, in the early days of the Medical Research Council, eugenics was actually quite entangled with them. And part of it was related to a fear that the lower social orders, the lower social classes had a sort of repository of illness, and along with that mental illness, mental health problems that had to be, had to be controlled and so on. So was the eugenics movement quite closely connected with NIMH and so forth?
That's a really good question. Thank you. So NIMH didn't open its doors until I think 1949, at which point eugenics had kind of fallen out of fashion, at least, as a formal movement that the nation was behind. So that really like forced sterilization campaigns and the money that was being spent to do, eugenics field research and open up these centers, that really peaked in the 1920s and 1930s. One thing that I remember from writing my first book, and that it was really in the early 1930s that Americans were beginning to have a distaste for eugenics. And that was largely because they were seeing the rise of the Third Reich. They were seeing the passage of some forced sterilization laws in Germany. And they really kind of, began to bristle at this idea of sterilizing entire classes of people. Now, eugenics didn't end then, right? It found new forms in America, but as this kind of state-sponsored project, it was kind of already, had fallen by the wayside by the time NIMH opened its doors in the late 1940s. That said, I would argue that a lot of the same concepts can drive the research at NIMH. So, one thing that actually somebody on here, I think it was Douglas, mentioned was the conceptualization of schizophrenia. If in the first half of the century, it was understood as something that primarily afflicted middle-class white women, that really changes with civil rights. Jonathan Metzl explores this in his book, The Protest Psychosis, which, basically asserts that with the civil rights movement, schizophrenia became recoded as a Black disease. And when that happened, everything changed. He says schizophrenia became a Black disease and prisons emerged where hospitals once stood. And so some of that thinking affects NIMH. This idea that schizophrenic people are dangerous, that they're a menace, that they need to be controlled with these antipsychotic drugs, which Metzl describes as chemical incarceration. Some of that thinking, affects NIMH from the 1960s onward. But I'm not aware of any overtly eugenics programs at NIMH.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farley. I'm kind of mindful that we've slightly run over time there. Hopefully it's been clear what a kind of fascinating and interesting talk everybody found that to be through such a kind of passionate discussion there. So I suppose on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for kind of giving up your time and for such an interesting and wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. This was really an honor for me. It's great to meet you all.
Thanks so much.